It's an easy crime to commit. A shooting on a residential block, in broad daylight. Multiple armed robberies, 3 blocks apart, same night. A neighborhood where the police department installed acoustic gunshot sensors because 911 calls weren't fast enough. A street the DEA itself has called the largest open-air drug market on the East Coast. You think you know Pennsylvania. Rolling farmland and covered bridges, Amish buggies on quiet back roads, Hershey's chocolate and Gettysburg battlefields, and small towns where everybody waves from the porch. But underneath the postcard version of this state is another Pennsylvania, one built on steel mills that shut their gates decades ago and never reopened, on coal towns that ran out of coal, on neighborhoods where the manufacturing jobs left and something much darker moved in to fill the space. This is the Pennsylvania that doesn't make it onto the tourism website. This is the Pennsylvania where police officers patrol in pairs, where GPS apps reroute you around certain zip codes for a reason, and where entire blocks of what used to be someone's home now stand hollowed out, windows boarded, waiting for a wrecking ball that state and city budgets can't afford. It's a version of the state most residents in Philadelphia's wealthy suburbs or Pittsburgh's revitalized downtown will never see up close, tucked into river valleys and old rail corridors just far enough off the interstate to stay out of sight, until you know exactly where to look. Don't stop. Don't ask for directions. Don't even slow down. Because by the end of this list, you'll understand exactly why. And the town at number 1 is so severe that federal drug agents have called it, on the record, one of the worst drug markets in the entire country. Every place on this list shares a common origin story, even if the details differ from town to town. A mill, a factory, a mine, or a rail yard built a community around a single dominant employer. For decades, that arrangement worked. Wages were steady, populations grew, downtowns filled with the kind of businesses that only exist when there's enough disposable income circulating through a community to support them. Then, sometime between the 1960s and the 1990s, that single employer either automated its workforce down to a fraction of its former size, moved production overseas where labor was cheaper, or simply shut its doors for good. What's left in each of these towns isn't just an empty factory. It's an entire local economy that was never rebuilt, a tax base that shrank right along with the population, and a police department left to cover the same territory with a fraction of the officers and a fraction of the funding it used to have. That's the pattern running underneath every single entry on this countdown, and once you see it in one town, you'll start noticing it in all of them. From the smallest river borough on this list to the largest city. Number 10. McKees Rocks. McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania sounds like it belongs on a postcard. A rock in the name, tucked along the Ohio River just outside Pittsburgh. The kind of small-town label that conjures fishing docks and Friday night football under the lights. For most of the 20th century, that image wasn't far off. McKees Rocks was a working-class railroad and manufacturing town, anchored by the massive pressed steel car company works that once employed thousands and shipped rail cars across the country. But the jobs that built this town are gone, and what's replaced them is a crime rate that, according to current FBI source data compiled by regional safety trackers, runs at roughly 65 violent and property incidents per 1,000 residents, a rate that puts this borough of fewer than 6,000 people at the very top of Pennsylvania's most dangerous list. Think about that ratio for a second. In a town this small, you don't need many incidents to post numbers like that, which means when something happens here, it happens close, and it happens often. Residents have learned to read the block, which porches have lights left on all night out of habit, which corners to avoid after the shift change at the remaining warehouses lets out, which alleys don't get plowed in winter because the borough doesn't have the budget and, unofficially, because fewer people go down them anyway. The old pressed steel complex still stands in pieces along the riverbank, rusted and fenced, a skeleton of the payroll that used to keep this place solvent. Drive along Chartier Avenue at night, and the storefronts thin out fast, replaced by a patchwork of vacant lots and buildings with plywood where display windows used to be. McKees Rocks isn't a big place, but per capita, official crime rate compilations rank it as the single most dangerous municipality in the entire state of Pennsylvania. And that's not a headline the borough advertises. What makes McKees Rocks especially unsettling isn't any single incident. It's the density. Officers assigned here work a jurisdiction barely over a square mile, which means the same handful of patrol cars end up cycling through the same handful of hot corners, night after night, in a town small enough that everyone already knows exactly where those corners are. The borough sits directly across the river from Pittsburgh's skyline, close enough that on a clear night you can see the downtown lights from the hillside streets above the old rail yards, a jarring contrast that longtime residents bring up almost reflexively. The glow of a booming city sitting a few miles from a community still waiting for its own recovery to start. Local business owners along Chartier's Avenue have described installing security gates they never would have considered a generation ago, and a handful of longtime shops have simply closed rather than absorb another round of break-ins. For a town its size, the math is brutal and unavoidable. Fewer residents, fewer eyes on the street, fewer resources to stretch across a crime rate that keeps climbing regardless. McKees Rocks bottoms, the low-lying flatland where much of the borough's remaining industry once operated, floods with enough regularity that entire blocks have been quietly abandoned to the water rather than rebuilt, adding yet another category of vacant, unsecured structures to a landscape that already has more than its small police force can watch. Community meetings here tend to circle the same handful of unresolved questions year after year. How to fund more patrol hours without raising taxes on a population that can't absorb another increase. How to demolish condemned structures faster than new ones get added to the list. And how to convince outside investors that a town this close to Pittsburgh is worth a second look despite the numbers. So far, those conversations haven't moved the needle much. The borough remains, by the numbers, the most dangerous municipality in the state, a distinction that residents here know intimately, even if the rest of Pennsylvania rarely thinks about this stretch of riverbank at all. Number 9. Ambridge, Pennsylvania sounds almost aspirational. A bridge built right into the name, like the town itself was engineered to connect people to something better. And in a sense, it was. Ambridge was founded around the American Bridge Company, a steel fabrication giant that built structural steel for skyscrapers and bridges across the country and gave the town both its name and its identity for most of the 20th century. For decades, a paycheck from American Bridge meant a house, a car, a stable life along the Ohio River in Beaver County. But like so many of the mill towns strung along Pennsylvania's rivers, the work dried up, the population shrank, and the tax base that used to fund police overtime and street lighting shrank right along with it. Today, with a population hovering around 6,800, Ambridge posts a violent crime rate that regional crime data trackers put at roughly 1,387 incidents per 100,000 residents, a number that, when you scale it down to a town this size, means violence isn't an abstraction here. It's a weekly reality. Old Economy Village, the preserved 19th century religious commune that sits within Ambridge's borders draws a trickle of history tourists who see manicured lawns and restored brick buildings a few blocks away, on Merchant Street and along the river flats. Boarded row houses tell an entirely different story. Residents describe a town split almost in two. The historic core kept alive by grant money and preservation societies, and the residential blocks behind it, where absentee landlords let properties rot and where police calls cluster around a handful of known trouble corners. You'd be flinching too if you'd watched, like longtime residents have, a neighbor's porch light become the unofficial signal for something's not right tonight. Ambridge was engineered to connect. What it's become is a warning sign for what happens when the company that built a town leaves it behind. Longtime residents will tell you the divide isn't subtle. Walk the blocks closest to the river and Old Economy Village, and you're in a different town entirely. Restored gardens, historical markers, a small but steady flow of visitors snapping photos of the preserved communal buildings. Head a few streets inland, toward the residential grid that used to house American Bridge's workforce, and the visitor traffic disappears along with the maintenance budgets. Absentee ownership is a constant complaint at borough council meetings. Property after property sits registered to landlords who live states away, collecting whatever rent they can while doing the bare minimum to keep a structure standing. That combination, a shrinking population trying to police a housing stock built for 3 times its current size, has left Ambridge with more vacant structures per capita than the borough's small police force can realistically monitor, and it shows up directly in the crime data year after year. You'd notice it in the pace of the town after dark, too. Shops along Merchant Street close early. Streetlights thin out past the historic core, and the traffic that once flowed toward the bridge company's shift changes has been replaced by a stillness that residents describe less as peaceful than as watchful. Beaver County as a whole has poured resources into revitalizing its riverfront communities over the past decade, and Ambridge has picked up some of that spillover. Grant-funded facade programs, a handful of new restaurants near the historic district, occasional talk of turning the old American Bridge Company site into mixed-use redevelopment. None of it has yet been enough to meaningfully move the borough's crime statistics, and residents who've watched previous redevelopment promises come and go tend to treat the latest round with the same guarded skepticism. What keeps drawing people back to Ambridge, longtime residents say, isn't the promise of what it might become. It's the stubborn loyalty of people who grew up here and simply won't leave, even as the town around them keeps testing that loyalty year after year. Number 8. Wilkinsburg. Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, sounds like exactly what it once was, a proud, dense little borough wedged against the eastern edge of Pittsburgh, full of handsome Victorian homes built for the managers and professionals who wanted to be close to the city without living in it. Drive through the historic district today, and you can still see the bones of that era. Wide porches, turrets, stained glass transoms above the doors. But Wilkinsburg's fortunes collapsed hard in the second half of the 20th century, as white flight, disinvestment, and the decline of Pittsburgh's industrial base hollowed the borough out from the inside. What's left is one of the starkest crime statistics in the entire state, a violent crime rate that safety researchers calculate at nearly 97% higher than the national average, and roughly 779 violent incidents per 100,000 residents annually, numbers that place this small borough of well under 15,000 people among Pennsylvania's most dangerous municipalities year after year. Median home values here sit far below the county average, and household incomes tell the same story of decades of disinvestment. For residents, that translates into lived experience, gunfire that's common enough to stop making the local news, Blocks where entire rows of the borough's once grand homes now stand condemned, spray painted with the orange X. That means the fire department has already been inside and knows what to expect if it burns. Wilkinsburg's police department, small and underfunded relative to the caseload it carries, has leaned on partnerships with Pittsburgh's own force for backup on larger incidents, a tacit admission that a borough this size was never built to handle a crime rate this severe on its own. The Victorian houses are still beautiful. That's almost the saddest part. Preservationists have tried for years to leverage that beauty into a comeback, pointing to Wilkinsburg's housing stock as some of the finest late 19th and early 20th century residential architecture anywhere in Allegheny County. Turrets, wraparound porches, leaded glass, the kind of craftsmanship that would command premium prices in almost any other market in the region. Instead, entire rows sit in tax delinquency, cycling through sheriff's sales for a fraction of what restoration would actually cost, while the borough's shrinking tax base struggles to fund basic code enforcement. Residents who've stayed describe a community holding on through sheer stubbornness. Block watch groups that meet in church basements, informal phone trees that spread word faster than any official alert system, longtime homeowners who refuse to sell even as the properties around them empty out one by one. Wilkinsburg's relationship with neighboring Pittsburgh only sharpens the frustration, a border so thin in places that a single street can have city police jurisdiction on one side and borough jurisdiction on the other, creating exactly the kind of seams that criminal activity tends to find and exploit. Wilkinsburg's school district faced its own reckoning years ago, ultimately dissolving its high school program and sending secondary students to Pittsburgh public schools under a special agreement. A decision that saved the district from outright financial collapse, but that many residents still describe as the moment Wilkinsburg lost one of the last institutions holding the community together in the way it once had. Faith communities have stepped into some of that gap, running food pantries, tutoring programs, and informal safety check networks out of church basements that dot nearly every block of the borough. Real estate investors, meanwhile, have begun buying up distressed properties at sheriff sale prices, betting on Wilkinsburg's proximity to Pittsburgh eventually driving values back up. A bet that, if it pays off, could reshape the borough within a generation, and one that longtime residents watch, with a mixture of cautious hope and genuine worry about who actually gets to stay for it. Number 7. Chester. Chester, Pennsylvania sounds like old money, and for a long time it was. Chester is the oldest city in Pennsylvania, older than Philadelphia itself, a Delaware River port town that boomed through the industrial era on shipbuilding, steel, and manufacturing that once made it one of the most productive small cities on the East Coast. But that same industrial base that built Chester abandoned it just as thoroughly. And what's replaced it is a violent crime rate that current safety analyses put at roughly 16.4 incidents per 1,000 residents, a figure researchers note actually surpasses even Philadelphia's most troubled districts, despite Chester being a fraction of the size. The city's West End, once dense with row houses for shipyard and steel workers, is now defined by block after block of vacant, boarded properties, the physical shell of an industrial base that simply isn't coming back. Those abandoned structures aren't just an eyesore. Police and residents alike describe them as a direct facilitator of the city's chronic crime problem, providing cover for drug activity and stash locations that a fully occupied street simply wouldn't allow. Chester's population has been cut by more than half since its industrial peak, and the ripple effects show up everywhere. In a school district that's operated for years under state financial oversight, in a municipal government that has repeatedly flirted with insolvency, and in a homicide rate that, for a city its size, ranks among the worst per capita in the entire country. Walk along 3rd Street near the waterfront and you can still see, in the old brick facades, the outline of a city that was supposed to be something else entirely. Chester didn't decline slowly. It fell off a cliff, and it never climbed back. The city's proximity to Philadelphia makes the contrast even harder to ignore. Drive 20 minutes up I-95, and you're in Center City, one of the wealthiest urban cores on the East Coast. Drive 20 minutes the other way, and you're in a city that has spent years under state financial oversight. Its school district repeatedly flagged for insolvency. Its municipal government forced to choose between paving roads and staffing its police force. Chester's waterfront has seen isolated investment, a sports stadium, a casino, that officials once hoped would trigger broader redevelopment. But longtime residents note that the jobs and revenue those projects generate rarely reach the neighborhoods that need them most. Meanwhile, the vacant housing stock keeps growing. As families leave for safer municipalities nearby, more properties revert to the city or sit abandoned entirely, adding to the exact conditions: empty structures, minimal foot traffic, thin police coverage, that criminologists point to as accelerants for exactly the kind of violent crime rate Chester keeps posting. Number 6. Reading, Pennsylvania sounds like the kind of place you'd pass through on the way to somewhere else. A name most people outside the state only recognize from the Monopoly board. For decades, though, Reading was a genuine industrial powerhouse, a rail and manufacturing hub in Berks County that at one point ranked among the wealthiest cities per capita in the entire United States. That era is long gone. Today, Reading regularly appears on national lists of America's poorest cities of its size, and current crime data puts its numbers at roughly 10.4 violent incidents and 8 property crimes per 1,000 residents annually. And for a long time, city officials treated that as simply the cost of doing business in a post-industrial downtown, until the numbers along the Central Corridor and around the transit hub got bad enough that something had to change. More than a third of the city's total reported offenses now cluster along that downtown strip and the transit hubs that feed it, a concentration police attribute in large part to regional narcotics distribution networks that use Reading's highway access as a corridor into the surrounding counties. In response, the Reading Police Department brought in ShotSpotter, an acoustic gunfire detection array designed to pinpoint shootings in real time, technology typically reserved for cities with far larger populations and far larger budgets, deployed here because officers needed every advantage they could get. Local officials point to a roughly 40% improvement in response times to shooting incidents since the system went live, alongside a targeted business improvement district effort to blanket Penn Street with security infrastructure. You'd notice it too if you walked that stretch after dark: cameras on nearly every corner, storefronts gated by early evening, and a downtown that empties out with a kind of practiced efficiency the moment the sun goes down. Reading's poverty numbers are part of what makes the city's trajectory so difficult to reverse. National rankings have repeatedly placed it among the poorest cities of its size in the entire country, a designation tied directly to the collapse of the rail and manufacturing base that once made this a genuinely prosperous place to live. Berks County's suburbs surrounding the city have largely thrived even as the urban core struggled, creating a familiar pattern seen across the state: wealth and safety pooling just outside city limits, while the urban center absorbs the costs of deindustrialization almost entirely on its own. Community leaders point to Reading's large and growing immigrant population as both a genuine strength: new small businesses, revitalized blocks, a real sense of civic energy in parts of the city, and a population especially vulnerable to the same narcotics networks the ShotSpotter system was built to counter. Given how concentrated poverty and language barriers can make certain neighborhoods easier for trafficking operations to move through undetected. City officials have leaned heavily on technology to close the gap that budget shortfalls can't fix directly. Beyond the ShotSpotter rollout, Reading's police department has expanded its camera network year over year, tying feeds from the Business Improvement District directly into a real-time crime center that dispatchers use to redirect patrols the moment gunfire is detected. Community leaders credit the approach with real, measurable gains along Penn Street specifically. But they're equally quick to point out that cameras and acoustic sensors don't create jobs, and that without addressing the underlying poverty driving the city's numbers, technology can only ever manage the crisis, not resolve it. Number 5. Harrisburg. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania sounds like the safest place in the state. Almost by definition, it's the capital after all, the seat of the governor's office and the state legislature, ringed by security details and state police cruisers. But step outside the Capitol complex itself, and the picture changes fast. Current crime data for Dauphin County's seat, home to just under 50,000 residents, shows a violent crime rate of roughly 900.5 incidents per 100,000 people. A figure regional analysts calculate as 128% above the national average, alongside a homicide rate of 26.4 per 100,000, among the highest of any Pennsylvania city its size. That statistic sits uneasily next to the Marble Dome and manicured Capitol lawn just blocks away, and residents in Harrisburg's neighborhoods beyond the government core will tell you the two Harrisburgs barely overlap. Allison Hill, one of the city's most densely populated residential sections, has for years carried a disproportionate share of the city's shootings, and city council meetings have repeatedly turned into public reckonings over how a capital city, one that filed for bankruptcy protection in 2011 under the weight of a failed incinerator project, ended up with crime numbers this severe while sitting at the center of the state's own government. Harrisburg's financial collapse wasn't abstract. It gutted city services for years, including the police department's staffing and equipment budgets, at precisely the moment the surrounding neighborhoods needed more of both. Drive a few blocks off Front Street, away from the river view and the dome, and the city's actual condition becomes obvious fast. It's the state's own capital, and it's also one of its most dangerous places to live. Harrisburg's 2011 bankruptcy filing wasn't a minor accounting problem. It was one of the largest municipal financial collapses in Pennsylvania history, triggered by a failed trash incinerator retrofit that saddled a city of under 50,000 people with hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. The state ultimately had to step in with a receivership program just to keep basic services running. And city departments, including the police bureau, spent years operating under budget constraints that most state capitals never have to consider. Officers who've worked Allison Hill describe patrol schedules built around known flashpoints, the blocks around certain corner stores, certain intersections that show up again and again in shooting reports, while city council members have spent successive terms debating how to fund community policing initiatives without a tax base large enough to sustain them. For a capital city, the optics are almost impossible to escape. Legislators drive past Allison Hill on their way to the State House, debating budgets for the entire Commonwealth, in a city that has struggled for over a decade to fund its own. Harrisburg's population is also younger and more transient than many of the other towns on this list, driven in part by turnover among state government staff and interns who cycle through the capital every few years without putting down permanent roots. That transience makes long-term community policing strategies harder to sustain. The kind of block-by-block trust building that takes years to develop keeps resetting as residents move in and out. Meanwhile, The Capitol complex itself remains one of the most heavily secured government buildings in the state, patrolled by its own dedicated state police detail, a stark contrast to the residential blocks just a short walk away where regular Harrisburg PD officers are stretched across a coverage area their staffing levels were never designed to handle. Number 4. Uniontown. Uniontown, Pennsylvania sounds almost like a boast. The Union right there in the name. A nod to the coal and coke industry that once made this Fayette County seat one of the wealthiest small cities per capita in the entire country. In the early 20th century, Uniontown's coal barons built mansions along a stretch of road so opulent it earned the nickname Millionaire's Row. And the city's downtown thrived on the wages of thousands of miners working the Connellsville coal seam that ran beneath the region. But coal, like steel, doesn't come back once the industry moves on, and Uniontown's population has been in steady decline for generations, dropping to a fraction of its historic peak. Current regional crime analyses place Uniontown among Pennsylvania's most dangerous small cities, driven by a combination of chronic unemployment, a shrinking tax base, and one of the more severe opioid crises to hit rural southwestern Pennsylvania, a region hit hard enough by prescription pill and heroin trafficking in the 2000s and 2010s that federal task forces specifically targeted Fayette County pipelines running up from Baltimore and Pittsburgh. Millionaire's Row still stands, its Gilded Age mansions now mostly converted to law offices, funeral homes, or simply sitting empty, waiting for buyers who never show up. A few blocks over, the downtown commercial strip that used to serve those coal wages is dotted with empty storefronts and check cashing shops, the retail evidence of a local economy that's never replaced what the mines once provided. Residents describe a town caught in a loop, not enough jobs to keep young people from leaving, and not enough population left to attract the kind of investment that might finally break the cycle. The opioid pipeline that hit Fayette County in the 2000s didn't arrive by accident. Federal investigators who traced trafficking routes into the region found a pattern repeated across rural Pennsylvania. Dealers exploiting cheap real estate and thin police coverage to set up distribution points that could feed both the local population and surrounding counties, using the same rural highways that once carried coal trucks to move product instead. Uniontown's hospital system, like many in the region, has spent years absorbing the downstream costs. Emergency room visits for overdoses, newborns treated for opioid exposure, a public health burden that local budgets were never built to carry at this scale. Community groups have opened recovery centers and needle exchange programs in storefronts that used to house dress shops and hardware stores, a quiet marker of exactly what the local economy now revolves around. Older residents who remember the Millionaire's Row era describe the shift almost like watching two different centuries collide on the same street. Fayette County as a whole has one of the lowest median household incomes in the state, and Uniontown, as the county seat, absorbs a disproportionate share of the social services demand that comes with that poverty. A court system handling a steady docket of drug-related cases, a county assistance office serving families from towns even smaller and more isolated than Uniontown itself, and a municipal budget that has to balance basic policing against a growing list of unfunded public health obligations. Downtown revitalization committees have tried, repeatedly, to lean into the town's coal baron architecture as a tourism draw, hosting historic walking tours past the surviving mansions on Main Street. It's a genuine point of local pride, and also, residents admit, a strange kind of dissonance. Celebrating a century-old wealth boom on the same streets, currently absorbing the fallout of the opioid crisis that followed it. Number 3. McKeesport. McKeesport, Pennsylvania, sounds like it should still be booming. For most of the 20th century, it was a Monongahela River steel town so productive that National Tube Works, the massive plant that anchored its economy, was at one point the largest tube and pipe manufacturing facility on Earth, employing tens of thousands of workers at its peak. That single fact tells you almost everything about what happened next. When a local economy is built entirely around one enormous employer, and that employer leaves, the town doesn't decline gradually. It collapses. National Tube shut down for good in the 1980s, and McKeesport's population, which once approached 55,000, has fallen to roughly 19,600 today, and the crime statistics that came with that collapse are staggering. Current FBI-sourced crime data puts McKeesport's violent crime rate at approximately 1,694 incidents per 100,000 residents, a figure regional analysts calculate as nearly 600% above the Pennsylvania state average, and enough to rank this Mon Valley city as the most dangerous in the entire state by that specific metric. The numbers break down into assault rates, robbery figures, and homicide counts that would be alarming in a city 3 times McKeesport's size. Local officials point to the same underlying drivers seen across the Mon Valley's other collapsed steel communities: elevated poverty, chronic unemployment, and gang activity that's moved into the vacuum left by the mill's closure. While community organizations like the Mon Valley Initiative have run structured blight removal programs, demolishing vacant and hazardous structures block by block and reporting measurable crime reductions of roughly 18% in the specific grids where that demolition work has been completed. Targeted foot patrols in the city's 5th Ward have similarly helped bring neighborhood assault numbers down in isolated pockets. But those are improvements measured against a baseline that remains one of the worst in the state. National Tube once made McKeesport a national name for the right reasons. Today, its per capita crime rate makes it a national name for entirely different ones. Walk the streets closest to the old National Tube site today, and the scale of what was lost becomes almost physically apparent. Block after block of rail spurs and foundation pads, fenced and empty, sized for an operation that once needed a small city's worth of workers just to keep the furnaces running. McKeesport's downtown, once dense enough to support multiple department stores and movie theaters on a single commercial strip, has been reduced to a handful of surviving storefronts interspersed with vacant buildings the city has struggled for years to either sell or demolish. Local hospital and library systems remain among the largest employers left in the city, a telling sign of just how completely the industrial employment base has been replaced by institutional and service work that pays a fraction of what the mill once did. Neighboring Duquesne and Clairton, both smaller Mon Valley steel towns that suffered nearly identical collapses when their own mills scaled back, share overlapping crime statistics and overlapping regional task forces. A reminder that McKeesport's story isn't an isolated tragedy so much as one especially severe example of a pattern that runs the length of the entire river valley. Community leaders point with real pride to the Mon Valley Initiative's demolition numbers and the measurable drop in crime within cleared grids, but they're candid about the scale of what's still left standing. Hundreds of additional vacant structures across the city, each one a potential foothold for exactly the kind of activity the demolition crews are working to eliminate. Number 2. Braddock. Braddock, Pennsylvania sounds like a footnote to Pittsburgh, a small borough most outsiders have never heard of, sitting just southeast of the city along a bend in the Monongahela River. But Braddock is where American industrial power was effectively born. Andrew Carnegie built his first steel mill here in 1875, the Edgar Thomson Works, and by 1920 that single plant had turned a stretch of riverbank into a borough of roughly 20,000 people. Complete with multiple movie theaters, a bustling business district, and the first Carnegie Library ever built in the United States. And for a while, until it wasn't, Braddock was the beating heart of American steel. Then came automation, foreign competition, and decades of plant downsizing that gutted the workforce the mill once needed. By the 1980s, Braddock's population had already fallen by more than 80%, and today, current figures put the borough's population at somewhere between 1,700 and 2,000 residents, a decline of roughly 90% from its historic peak, one of the single steepest population collapses of any town in the entire United States. Drive through Braddock today, and entire residential blocks stand functionally empty. Houses collapsing in on themselves, yards reclaimed by overgrowth, streetlights illuminating rows of structures with no one living behind their windows. The Edgar Thomson Works still operates along the river, employing a few hundred workers where it once employed tens of thousands, its smokestacks still visible from nearly anywhere in the borough. A constant, smoking reminder of what this place used to be and how little of it remains. Braddock's former mayor, a Harvard-educated public policy graduate who moved to the borough through AmeriCorps in the early 2000s, spent over a decade trying to rebrand Braddock as an urban frontier for artists and entrepreneurs willing to buy property for almost nothing. And while a handful of new businesses have taken root along the main commercial strip, the underlying math of the borough hasn't changed. A town built for 20,000 people is now home to less than a tenth of that number, aging, isolated, and surrounded on all sides by the physical wreckage of an industry that isn't coming back. There's a strange, specific irony to Braddock's more recent history. For a stretch of over 3 years, the borough recorded no homicides at all, a statistic local leaders held up at the time as proof that revitalization efforts, new small businesses, arts grants, community policing partnerships were actually working. But a homicide-free streak in a town of under 2,000 people isn't the same thing as safety at scale. It's a reflection of how few people are left to be victims or perpetrators of anything at all. Braddock's demographics tell their own story. The borough's remaining population skews older and disproportionately black, a group that stayed as others left, either by choice, by circumstance, or because leaving simply wasn't financially possible. Brew Gentleman, Braddock Public House, and a handful of other small businesses that have opened along the main commercial strip in recent years represent real investment and real optimism. But they sit within blocks of residential streets where entire structures have collapsed from decades of neglect. Roofs caved in, walls open to the weather, a physical record of just how far this borough fell before anyone started trying to build it back up. It's a small enough place that visitors sometimes walk through in under 20 minutes and still leave with a real, lasting sense of just how much history and just how much loss is packed into those few narrow blocks along the river. National media attention has cycled through Braddock periodically for over 2 decades now, drawn each time by the same striking contrast: a nearly abandoned American town, once a symbol of industrial might, now positioned as a testbed for whether small-scale, grassroots revitalization can actually work in a place this far gone. Documentary crews, photojournalists, and urban planning researchers have all made the trip to Braddock to study it, and the borough has become something of a case study in post-industrial recovery efforts nationally, cited in academic papers and municipal planning documents from other struggling towns looking for a roadmap. Whether that attention translates into a genuinely different future for Braddock, or simply becomes one more chapter in a very long story of promises made to Mon Valley steel towns, remains, by most honest local accounts, still an open question. Number 1. Kensington, Philadelphia. Kensington, Pennsylvania sounds like nothing at all to most people outside the region. just another neighborhood name buried inside a much larger city. That anonymity doesn't last long once you actually see it. Kensington is a section of North Philadelphia that, over the last 3 decades, has become something federal drug enforcement officials have described on the record as the largest open-air drug market on the entire East Coast of the United States. Not a nickname, not internet exaggeration, but a designation used by the DEA itself. And for a long time, that description would have sounded like hyperbole to anyone who hadn't walked Kensington Avenue after dark. It doesn't anymore. This is where our list has been building toward, and it earns every bit of that buildup. Kensington's collapse traces back to the same root cause as nearly every other town on this list: deindustrialization. Philadelphia's manufacturing base, which Kensington's row houses were originally built to house, hollowed out through the 1960s and 1970s, and into that economic vacuum came, over successive decades, a rotating cast of drugs that each left the neighborhood worse than the last. Heroin took hold first, entrenching Kensington by the late 1990s as, according to longtime residents and multiple journalistic accounts, the best place on the entire East Coast to buy it, a grim reputation that drew buyers from as far as Maine and Florida directly to Kensington Avenue. The 2000s brought a wave of diverted prescription opioids. Then came fentanyl, a synthetic opioid federal officials note is somewhere between 80 and 100 times more potent than morphine, which didn't just intensify the crisis, it multiplied the death toll almost overnight, as users accustomed to heroin dosing had no way to gauge a drug that potent. And then came xylazine, tranq, and Kensington crossed into something the country hadn't fully seen before. Xylazine is a veterinary sedative, approved by the FDA exclusively for animal use, never intended anywhere near a human bloodstream. Dealers began cutting it into fentanyl supplies because it stretches the product and extends the high. By the early 2020s, law enforcement sources and city drug testing data placed xylazine in roughly 90% of Philadelphia's entire street opioid supply, a saturation rate that effectively meant almost no one buying dope in Kensington could avoid it even if they wanted to. Xylazine doesn't respond to standard overdose reversal medication the way opioids do, which means an overdose here is measurably harder to pull someone back from. And it does something else, something that's made Kensington internationally infamous in a way no other town on this list can claim. It causes severe necrotic wounds at injection sites, open, oozing lesions that don't heal, that spread, that in serious cases require amputation. Combined with fentanyl's sedative effect, users often stand frozen mid-motion for minutes at a time, bent forward at impossible angles. A phenomenon so visually distinct that it's given rise to the term you've likely already heard used to describe this neighborhood: Zombieland. Searches for the phrase Kensington zombies reportedly number in the thousands every single month, and viral video footage shot along Kensington Avenue, people passed out mid-stride, wounds visible through torn clothing, entire sidewalks lined with individuals in a chemical stupor, has been viewed hundreds of millions of times worldwide, turning a single Philadelphia street into a kind of grim international shorthand for American addiction at its most visible and its most severe. The human cost behind that footage is staggering. Philadelphia recorded over 1,400 overdose deaths in a single recent year, the majority concentrated in and around Kensington, and city data shows overdose fatalities climbing nearly every year since 2018. Deaths in the city's Black and Hispanic communities specifically rose by 87% and 43% respectively over a comparable 5-year stretch. a disparity that public health officials tie directly to the neighborhood's demographics and its decades-long role as ground zero for the crisis. And the drug supply keeps evolving in ways that keep outpacing the response. Medetomidine, another animal sedative even more potent than xylazine in some respects, has more recently begun showing up in Kensington's street-level dope, according to reporting from harm reduction workers embedded in the neighborhood, meaning the chemical composition of what's being sold on Kensington Avenue today is, in a very real sense, still getting worse, not better. Kensington police have documented more than 80 individual corners operating as active open-air drug markets within the neighborhood at any given time. Not one central strip, but a dense block-by-block network that makes the area functionally impossible to police through conventional patrol alone. That reality has made Kensington a flashpoint in Philadelphia's mayoral politics. With the current administration coming into office in early 2024, on a tough-on-crime platform built substantially around the promise to finally dismantle Kensington's drug economy. Appointing a dedicated deputy police commissioner specifically tasked with the neighborhood and pushing large-scale sustained arrest and encampment clearing operations along the avenue. Progress has been real in places and painfully slow in others. Dealers displaced from one corner routinely resurface blocks away, and residents who've lived through multiple crackdowns over the decades have learned not to celebrate too early. The economics of Kensington's drug trade are what make it so resistant to conventional law enforcement. Longtime users and harm reduction workers alike have described the neighborhood, half joking and half in despair, as the Walmart of heroin, a place where product has historically been cheaper, purer, more consistently available, and easier to find than almost anywhere else on the East Coast, which is precisely what's kept drawing buyers in from other states even as the city's own overdose numbers climbed. That reputation became self-reinforcing. More buyers meant more dealers meant more competition, and more competition meant prices low enough to keep drawing in exactly the population most vulnerable to addiction in the first place. Harm reduction organizations operating along the avenue, groups running needle exchanges, wound care stations, and naloxone distribution directly on the sidewalk have become a permanent fixture of the neighborhood's daily rhythm, treating xylazine wounds that in other cities would be almost unheard of outside a veterinary clinic. Their outreach workers describe a triage reality most emergency responders never have to face. Assessing, block by block, who's simply sedated and who's actively overdosing, in a crowd where the visual difference between the two isn't always obvious even to trained eyes. The physical toll on the neighborhood's built environment mirrors the toll on its residents. Row houses that once housed textile and shipping workers now sit gutted by fire, squatted or boarded in long, unbroken rows, the same architectural pattern seen in Chester and McKeesport repeated here at a scale magnified by Philadelphia's sheer size. Encampments have formed and reformed along the elevated train tracks that run above Kensington Avenue for years, cleared periodically by city crews only to rebuild within weeks, a cycle residents and outreach workers describe as fundamentally unsolvable, without addressing the underlying addiction crisis rather than simply relocating it. Local business owners who've stayed, a scattering of bodegas, auto shops, and family-run restaurants operating in the middle of all of it, describe daily life built around routines that would sound extreme almost anywhere else in the country. Stepping over people mid-overdose on the walk to open the shop, keeping naloxone behind the register next to the register tape, watching regular customers disappear for weeks at a time and hoping it's rehab and not the alternative. What ties Kensington to every other entry on this list is the same root cause playing out at a radically larger scale: an industrial economy that left, and nothing durable enough built in its place to catch the people left behind. McKees Rocks, Ambridge, Wilkinsburg, Chester, Reading, Harrisburg, Uniontown, McKeesport, and Braddock all show pieces of this same collapse: vacant housing, vanished payrolls, crime statistics that outpace their population size many times over. Kensington shows what that collapse looks like when it happens inside one of the largest cities in the United States, magnified by scale, amplified by the internet, and left to run for decades without the kind of intervention that might have changed its course. It is, by nearly every metric federal and local officials track, the single most severe entry on this entire list, and the reason so many law enforcement agents who work this specific stretch of Philadelphia choose to go armed, in pairs, and prepared for absolutely anything. Outside groups have tried, with mixed success, to import solutions from other cities' opioid responses, supervised consumption sites modeled on programs in Canada and parts of Europe, expanded medication-assisted treatment access, targeted diversion programs meant to route low-level users into treatment rather than the court system. Nearly every one of those efforts has run into the same wall in Philadelphia: fierce community and political opposition, much of it from Kensington residents themselves, who argue that the neighborhood has already absorbed more than its share of the region's addiction crisis and shouldn't be asked to host formalized drug use infrastructure on top of everything else. That tension between harm reduction advocates who see supervised sites as life-saving and residents who see them as one more burden dropped on an already overwhelmed community has stalled major policy shifts for years, even as the death toll along Kensington Avenue keeps climbing. It's a debate with no easy resolution, playing out block by block, in real time, on one of the most closely watched streets in the entire country. What makes Kensington different from every other entry on this list isn't just the scale of the crisis, it's the visibility of it. The abandoned steel towns further up this countdown hide their decline behind boarded windows and empty storefronts, a quiet, creeping kind of collapse you have to actually drive through to notice. Kensington's collapse plays out in the open, on a public sidewalk, in broad daylight, filmed constantly and uploaded instantly, a neighborhood suffering turned into a permanent, unwilling spectacle for a global audience. It has become, almost against its own residents' will, the single most photographed and most discussed drug crisis zone in the entire United States, and it earned that reputation one collapsed industry, one new drug, and one overdose statistic at a time. From the compressed crime density of a small river borough like McKees Rocks to the internationally infamous streets of Kensington, these are communities facing real, documented crises, the kind built by decades of factories closing, jobs leaving, and support systems failing to catch what was left behind. 10 towns, 10 different industries, 10 different decades of collapse, 10 different sets of statistics pulled from 10 different corners of this state. And yet the underlying story barely changes from one entry to the next. A payroll disappears, a population shrinks, a police budget stretches thinner, and crime fills the space that opportunity used to occupy. These aren't caricatures, and they aren't cautionary tales dreamed up for a video. They're real places, with real people, still living in them, still raising kids, still opening small businesses on blocks their grandparents once worked, doing what they can with what's left of towns that used to be something else entirely. If this video gave you something to think about, we're asking you to do 3 things for us right now. First, subscribe. We work hard to bring you content that is researched, honest, and important, and channels like this one only keep going with your support. Second, drop a comment and tell us if you've been to any of these towns or if you grew up somewhere with a similar story. We read every one, and some of the best context we get on these videos comes directly from people who've actually lived through what we're describing. And third, share this video. Send it to someone planning a road trip through Pennsylvania, someone considering a move to the region, or anyone who thinks they already know this state inside and out because they've driven past the exit signs 100 times without ever actually stopping. They might be surprised by what's actually out there, just off the highway, in towns most people never think to look twice at. We'll see you in the next one, on the next stretch of highway, in the next town most people drive straight past without a second thought.